There is a distinct weight to a star at 120 dial. Caliper manufactured in 1985. It is made of hardened stainless steel, heavy enough to anchor a stack of blueprints against a stiff Alabama breeze, and precise enough to measure a human hair down to the thousandth of an inch. I keep it on the right side of my desk, exactly 3 inches from the edge, right next to a worn green cutting mat. For 37 years, that tool has reminded me of a simple truth that defines my entire life, both inside the machine shop and outside of it. If you do not measure accurately at the beginning, the structural failure at the end is entirely your own fault. I measure twice, I cut once, and when things go wrong, I do not lose my temper. I simply re-examine the data points. It was exactly 5:14 a.m. when I arrived at my workshop in Huntsville, Alabama, just off Fountain Row. The morning air was thick with that peculiar southern humidity that smells of damp earth and coming rain, beautiful the way certain storms are beautiful before they tear the roof off your house. I unlocked the heavy steel door, turned on the overhead fluorescent lights, and listened to them hum to life. It is a quiet authority, that hum. It tells you that the power is on, stable, and waiting for instructions. I sat down at my desk, picked up my caliper, and began my morning routine. I count things when I am nervous, or when the air around me feels slightly out of balance. Today, I found myself counting the seconds between the hums of the compressor. I tapped the crystal face of my old automatic watch, a habit I developed back in the 90s, when a digital readout just could not satisfy my need to see the gears actually moving. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor, subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. I am 62 years old, and my name is Elias. If you walked into my shop on any given Tuesday, you would see a man who looks exactly like what he is, a mechanical engineer who spent his prime years designing specialized hydraulic manifold systems for heavy industrial machinery. My hands are rough, lined with faint silver scars from stray metal shavings, and my hair has been the color of a wet slate sidewalk for a decade. I do not shout, and I do not make scenes in public. People in Huntsville know me as a quiet man. Some of them mistake that silence for an absence of ambition, or worse, a lack of awareness. They assume that because I do not speak up during town council meetings or brag about my retirement portfolio at the local diner, I am simply letting the world pass me by. Here's the thing about quiet men, though. We are not missing anything. We are just compiling a ledger while everyone else is busy wasting their breath. My phone rang at exactly 6:30 a.m. It was Marcus. Marcus has been my closest friend since we were roommates at Auburn University in 1982, back when we both thought we could change the world with a T-square and a bottle of cheap rye whiskey. Today, Marcus is an intellectual property attorney with an office on Madison Street that smells permanently of old leather bindings and expensive burnt coffee. He is a practical man, completely devoid of sentimentality, and the only person alive who can tell me I am being an old fool without making me want to lock the door in his face. I remember a fishing trip we took in the summer of 1994, up near Guntersville Lake. Our boat engine died 3 miles from the marina, and instead of panicking, Marcus pulled out a copy of the state maritime regulations to see if the county owed us a free tow, based on an obscure 19th century transport statute. We ended up rowing back anyway, but that is just how his mind works. He looks for the leverage points in the system. Elias, Marcus said, his voice coming through the speaker with that dry, gravelly rasp that always means business. I am looking at the Federal Registry updates from yesterday evening. You need to come down to the office. Bring the 2024 design logs for the high-pressure actuator series, the ones you were working on before the wedding. I went very, very quiet. I did not ask him why. I did not ask him if he was sure. When you have known a man for over 40 years, you learn to read the empty spaces between his sentences. I simply reached across the green mat, picked up the black leather-bound journal where I record every single calculation, every tolerance adjustment, and every material specification by hand, and slid it into my briefcase. I will not be taking questions about why I still use a physical ledger in an era dominated by cloud storage. Cloud storage can be wiped by a disgruntled intern with a bad password. A leather ledger requires a fire, and even then, ash leaves a trail, if you know how to look for it. I drove my 2008 gray Ford F-150 through the streets of Huntsville, the engine purring, with that perfect rhythmic mechanical health that comes from changing your own oil every 3,000 miles on the dot. I parked in the gravel lot behind Marcus's building, walked up the creaky wooden stairs, and found him sitting behind a desk, buried under 3 separate towers of legal briefs. He did not say good morning. He didn't offer me a cup of that terrible coffee. He just slid a single printed document across the mahogany wood. "Look at the filer's name," Marcus said, pointing a blunt, ink-stained finger at the bottom of the page. I leaned in, adjusted my reading glasses, and read the bold text. The document was a provisional patent application for a high-efficiency hydraulic actuator valve designed specifically for deep well oil extraction machinery. It was a brilliant design, if I do say so myself, capable of operating at pressures exceeding 25,000 pounds per square inch without experiencing material fatigue. The engineering specs listed on the page were flawless. Every radius, every fluid dynamics equation, every metallurgical composition was exactly as I had conceived it over 3 long winters of solitary work in my shop. But the name listed under the inventor column was not Elias Vance. The name on the document was Julian Vance, clerk. Julian is my stepson. He is 24 years old, possesses a degree in business administration from a university that spends more money on its football stadium than its engineering laboratory, and wears suits that look like they were assembled from a catalog for young men who want to look important on LinkedIn. I married his mother, Clara, 12 years ago, after his biological father walked out on them with nothing but a suitcase and a mountain of credit card debt. I raised Julian. I paid for his braces. I bought him his first car, a sensible, safe sedan that he complained about for 3 months. And when he told me he wanted to enter the industrial supply business, I did not discourage him. I opened my shop to him. I showed him how the business operated from the ground up. I tried to teach him that cleverness is fast, but what I do is slow. He preferred fast. I sat in Marcus's office for a while staring at the paper. The silence sat between us like a fifth guest at a table set for 4. I could hear the faint sound of traffic down on Madison Street, the squeak of a delivery truck's brakes, the distant bark of a dog. My thumb was tapping the face of my watch. 12 rapid beats, then a pause, then 12 more. He filed. "It's 6 days ago," Marcus said quietly. "The day after your anniversary dinner." He used a shell company registered in Delaware, called Apex Innovation Partners. But he forgot that Delaware corporations still have to list a natural person as the primary contact on the initial filing fee documentation if they use certain expedited processing routes. He was in a hurry, Elias. He wanted this locked down before the State Economic Development Board announced the bidding for the new aerospace manufacturing infrastructure contract next month. I stood up, took the document, and folded it neatly into thirds before placing it inside my breast pocket. I did not curse. I did not hit the desk. My jaw was doing that thing, that slow rhythmic grinding thing, that Clara always notices when I am trying to figure out how a machine broke down, but my voice remained perfectly level. "Thank you, Marcus," I said. "Are you going to confront him?" Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing as he leaned back in his leather chair. "Because if you go in there with your chest out, he is just going to deny it, claim it was an independent discovery, and tie you up in civil court until your retirement savings are completely drained. He has the backing of Vanguard Industrial now. They signed him to a preliminary production agreement yesterday morning. It's a $3.5 million contract, Elias. He isn't a kid playing in your garage anymore. He is a contractor with a legal team." I looked at my old friend, and for the first time in months, I almost smiled. Almost. I held up one hand. "Just one. I don't do confrontations, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping an octave into that quiet, steady register that usually makes people stop talking. "Confrontations are loud. They are chaotic. When a machine has a loose bolt, you don't scream at the machine. You just turn off the power, find the right wrench, and tighten it until the movement stops. I am going to go home. I am going to have dinner with my wife, And then I am going to see my son. I walked out of the office and into the Alabama sun. Something in my stomach shifted, a cold, heavy sensation that I recognized from my time in the manufacturing plants back in the late 80s when an overhead crane cable would start to fray. You could hear it before you saw it, a tiny metallic ping that told you the entire structure was about to change its shape. I didn't know it yet, but that single printed page in my pocket was the first red flag of a pattern that went much deeper than a stolen blueprint. Julian hadn't just taken my drawings. He had taken my legacy, and he had done it with the absolute certainty that an old man like me would never have the stomach to fight back. He thought I was just a component in his machine. He forgot that I was the one who designed the assembly line. I drove home via Interstate 5, keeping the speedometer pinned exactly at 65. Keeping the speedometer pinned exactly at 65 miles per hour. The late afternoon sun was reflecting off the hood of my truck, casting long fractured shadows across the dashboard. I sat in my car for a while after pulling into the driveway, just listening to the engine click as it cooled down. There is a specific rhythm to a cooling engine, a predictable thermal contraction of steel and aluminum. Humans, on the other hand, do not contract predictably. They expand into the empty spaces you leave for them, and sometimes they break the container. I thought about $85,412. That was the exact figure, down to the penny, that I had wired to out-of-state university bursars over 4 years to ensure Julian graduated without the suffocating weight of student debt. I kept the receipts in a blue manila folder in my filing cabinet. I do not keep them out of some petty sense of scorekeeping, but because I document everything. I mean that literally. If you do not track your inputs, you have no right to complain about your outputs. When I walked through the front door of our house in Fountain City, Clara was in the kitchen. She is a woman who moves with a quiet, undeniable grace, her hair tied back, humming some old radio tune while chopping vegetables. I love my wife. I need to state that clearly for the record. But love does not grant you a bypass around reality. And Clara's reality has always contained a massive, impenetrable blind spot shaped exactly like her son. To her, Julian is simply ambitious. To me, ambition without discipline is just a controlled explosion waiting to breach its casing. I washed my hands, the rough soap scrubbing away the faint smell of machine oil, and walked into the dining room. I didn't know it yet, but the evening was about to provide the exact confirmation I needed to move forward. Before I could even pour myself a glass of water, the front door swung open. Julian walked in without knocking, an old habit he never bothered to break. He was wearing a navy blue tailored suit and a pair of leather loafers that probably cost more than my first lathe. He smelled of expensive cedar cologne and unearned confidence. He was holding a bottle of champagne by the neck. "Mom, Elias, get in here," Julian called out, his voice echoing too loudly in the quiet house. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and hurried out of the kitchen, her face instantly brightening. I followed slowly, stopping at the edge of the hallway. Julian popped the cork on the champagne. It hit the ceiling, leaving a small, damped dent in the drywall. I didn't say anything. I just watched the foam spill over the lip of the bottle onto Clara's hardwood floor. "What are we celebrating, sweetheart?" Clara asked, beaming. Julian poured 2 glasses, completely ignoring the spill. He finally looked up at me, a wide, perfectly practiced smile on his face. I closed it. Vanguard Industrial. They signed the preliminary production agreement for the new actuator valves. $3.5 million for the initial run. Clara gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "Julian, oh my God, that's incredible. A multi-million-dollar contract. At your age? I told you I was going to make it happen, Mom," Julian said, taking a sip from his glass. He turned his body fully toward me, his eyes locking onto mine. He was looking for something. Anger, perhaps. Shock. Betrayal. He wanted to see the exact moment the knife twisted. "What do you think, Elias? Not bad for a guy who used to sweep your shop floors. Right? Turns out all that time watching you tinker with those old blueprints actually paid off." Our eyes met. The silence had weight to it. It was heavy, dense, like a block of lead sitting right in the center of the living room. "It's a very large contract, Julian," I said gently. It's the future, he replied, his chin tilting up a fraction of an inch. Vanguard wants the first 50 prototype units delivered in exactly 6 weeks for field testing. Once they approve the field tests, they release the bulk of the funding. I've already secured a manufacturing facility over in Decatur to handle the production. Here's the thing about manufacturing high-pressure hydraulic components. You do not just handle production. You court it. You beg the metal to behave. You pray to the gods of metallurgy. And you verify every single tolerance with a micrometer. Julian was talking about building 25,000 psi pressure valves the way someone talks about printing business cards. 6 weeks is a tight window for prototype fabrication, I noted, keeping my voice perfectly level. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, especially for a design you haven't physically tested yet. That's why I hired a team of actual engineers, Elias, Julian said. The words were wrapped in a smile, but the edges were razor sharp. No offense, but the industry has moved past hand-drawn ledgers and manual lathes. We're using automated CNC centers. We're scaling fast. Fine is a word that sounds like a compliment, but isn't. I don't want fine. I want perfect, and I want it at scale. I see, I said. Are you not going to congratulate him, Elias? Clara asked, her voice faltering slightly. Her hand was still frozen on the edge of the dining table. She could feel the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure, even if she didn't understand the storm that was causing it. Of course, I said. I walked over, picked up the second glass of champagne he had poured, and raised it an inch. Congratulations, Julian. You have secured a very significant obligation. I hope the design holds up under pressure. It will, Julian said, his smile hardening into a smirk. It's a flawless design. I practically dreamed it up overnight. You know what I did? I laughed. Internally, of course. Which, if you know me, is the closest thing to a miracle. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance required to steal a man's life work and then brag to his face about dreaming it up overnight is almost beautiful, the way a perfectly symmetrical poison dart frog is beautiful. It warns you exactly what it is. After dinner, which tasted like ash and cardboard, Julian left to meet his new partners for celebratory drinks. Clara went to bed early, complaining of a stress headache. I went back out to the driveway, got into my F-150, and drove back to the shop in the dark. I unlocked the door and turned on the single desk lamp. The glow cast a warm yellow circle over my green cutting mat and the starlit caliper. I sat down and opened my black leather ledger to the entries from April 2024. This was the exact time frame when Julian had been coming to the shop every evening, bringing me coffee, my name, asking me detailed questions about my work, acting like a son who finally wanted to connect with his aging stepfather. I traced my finger down the page of calculations for the high-efficiency hydraulic actuator valve, the exact valve Julian had just sold to Vanguard. Julian is not a stupid young man. He knows how to read an engineering schematic. He knows how to copy dimensions, material requirements, and flow rate formulas. When he photographed my blueprints, he took exactly what he needed to build the mechanism. But because he is impatient, and because he views the physical world as an inconvenience, rather than a teacher, he missed the fundamental lesson of the machine. He didn't read the footnotes. In a high-pressure system, operating deep underground, temperatures can easily exceed 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel expands. Beryllium copper, which I had specified for the primary seal, expands at a different rate. If you machine the parts exactly to the dimensions shown on the master blueprint, the valve will function perfectly at room temperature. But the moment you expose it to a 400-degree environment, the thermal expansion coefficient dictates that the copper seal will expand by exactly 0.004 inches more than the steel housing, 4/1000ths of an inch. It is less than the thickness of a sheet of standard copy paper. But in a 25,000 psi system, 4/1000ths of an inch of uncompensated pressure is not a leak. It is a catastrophic, explosive, structural failure. The only way to prevent that failure is an intricate secondary stress relief channel, machined into the inner housing. That channel was not on the blueprint Julian stole. It was in my head, and it was in the final approved patent filing that Marcus and I had submitted under a blind corporate LLC 8 months ago. long before Julian even knew the design existed. Julian had just sold Vanguard Industrial a $3.5 million bomb, and he had signed a contract guaranteeing its flawless operation. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the silence of the shop. I had warned him. I had tried to teach him that cleverness is fast, but what I do is slow. He had chosen fast. Now, the Vanguard contract clock was ticking down from 6 weeks, and I knew with absolute certainty that when his 50 prototype units hit the testing ovens in Decatur, they were going to tear themselves apart from the inside out. And trust me, the only person on earth who held the legal rights to the solution was sitting in a dark shop in Huntsville, Alabama, doing exactly nothing. 6 weeks in the manufacturing world is exactly 1,008 hours. When you are waiting for a machine to fail, those hours do not move in a straight line. They stretch and compress, bending around the silence in your workshop and the casual conversations at the dinner table. I spent those weeks doing exactly what I have done every day for 37 years. I woke up at 5 in the morning, drank 1 cup of black coffee, and went to my shop in Fountain City. I turned on the lathe, sometimes not to make anything, but just to hear the steady, rhythmic hum of the motor. It grounded me. It reminded me that physics does not negotiate. During week 3, Julian bought a new car. It was a 2025 Audi RS5, painted a shade of metallic gray that probably had a ridiculous name like Quantum Ash. He drove it over to the house on a Sunday afternoon, parking it diagonally across the driveway so Clara could see it from the kitchen window. He tossed the heavy key fob onto the kitchen island. It made a loud, hollow thud against the granite. "First distribution check from Vanguard cleared," Julian announced, leaning against the counter and crossing his arms. He was wearing a watch that cost more than the foundation of my shop. "They advanced us 10% to cover the raw beryllium copper for the prototype run. I figured I'd treat myself. You have to look the part if you want them to take you seriously." "It's beautiful, Julian," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for me to say something supportive. I looked at the car through the window. "It has a twin-turbo V6, I said quietly. "Lots of complex plumbing under that hood. Make sure you don't skip the maintenance schedule. High performance means high fragility." Julian rolled his eyes, a tight, patronizing little smile forming on his face. "It's under warranty, Elias. I don't need to get my hands dirty. If something breaks, I just hand them the keys and they give me a new one." That's how business works now. I didn't argue. I didn't point out that Vanguard Industrial wasn't a car dealership and they didn't hand out loaner contracts when you destroyed their testing facility. I just nodded, picked up my coffee mug, and went out to the back porch. Arrogance is a high-interest loan, and Julian was borrowing heavily against a future that was about to collapse. By week 5, the atmosphere in Huntsville began to shift. The industrial manufacturing community in northern Alabama is a small town wrapped inside a city. Gossip doesn't travel through text messages. It travels through supply chain delays, canceled material orders, and panicked phone calls to specialized machinists. Marcus came over to my shop on a Thursday evening. He didn't knock. He just walked in, carrying 2 paper cups of that terrible burnt coffee from the deli across from his office. He set one down on my green cutting mat, exactly 3 inches from my Starrat caliper. "They started the stress tests in Decatur this morning," Marcus said, pulling up a metal stool. His voice was flat, but his eyes were sharp. I wiped a layer of grease off a socket wrench with a blue shop towel. And Marcus said, taking a sip of his coffee and grimacing, "Panic moves through a corporate office like water through a cracked foundation. They loaded the first 3 prototype valves into the thermal simulation oven, brought the ambient temperature up to 420 degrees, and applied 20,000 psi of internal hydraulic pressure." I stopped wiping the wrench. I didn't look up. "Did they breach?" "Breach is a polite word for it, Elias. They detonated," Marcus replied, a grim satisfaction settling into his gravelly voice. "The beryllium copper seals expanded faster than the steel housing. No stress relief channel. The internal friction locked the actuator pins dead in their tracks. The pressure spiked, and the casing sheared right off the mounting brackets. They blew out the safety glass on the testing oven. Vanguard's lead safety inspector practically had a heart attack. I went very, very quiet. I pictured the metal tearing. I pictured the exact moment the physics asserted their dominance over Julian's stolen blueprint. Was anyone hurt? No, Marcus said. Safety protocols held, but Vanguard halted the entire test. They gave Julian's company exactly 72 hours to explain the structural failure and present a revised schematic, or they are triggering the breach of contract clause. That means demanding the entire $350,000 advance back, plus penalties, and blacklisting his firm from every major defense and energy contractor in the state. Julian had spent the advance. A portion of it was sitting in my driveway, painted quantum ash. The rest was likely tied up in non-refundable leases for his automated CNC machines in Decatur. What is Julian doing? I asked, setting the wrench down carefully. He is doing what impatient men do when the math stops working, Marcus said. He is screaming at his engineers. For the next 48 hours, I went about my life. I ate dinner with Clara. I fixed a leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. I watched the evening news. On Friday night, I saw Julian's Audi blow past our house at 80 miles an hour, heading toward the highway. He didn't stop. His engineers, a group of bright, terrified kids fresh out of college, had undoubtedly figured out the problem. They had run the thermal expansion formulas. They had realized they needed a stress relief channel to absorb the copper's expansion, and then they had done exactly what I knew they would do. They searched the United States Patent and Trademark Office database to see if they could legally machine that specific channel into a high-pressure actuator valve without getting sued by a competitor. They found out that they couldn't, because Apex Innovation Partners owned the provisional patent for that exact configuration. The trap hadn't just snapped shut, it had locked itself from the outside. Julian needed that patent to fix his valves. Without it, his company was dead. With it, he might just salvage the Vanguard contract. But Apex Innovation Partners was a ghost. It had no website, no public office, and no phone number. It only had a registered legal representative on file in the state of Alabama. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. On Saturday morning, at exactly 9:15 a.m., I was sitting at the kitchen table, eating a bowl of oatmeal. Clara was watering the ferns on the porch. My phone screen lit up. It was Marcus. I answered it and put it on speaker, setting it down next to my coffee cup. "Good morning, Marcus," I said. He called, Elias, Marcus said, his voice crackling slightly over the connection. "Julian, just called the office." I stopped with my spoon halfway to my mouth. "Did he?" He sounds like a man who hasn't slept in 3 days. He tracked the Apex LLC registration to my firm. He wants to buy the patent rights to the stress relief channel. He offered me $50,000 for a perpetual licensing agreement. He said it was an emergency. That is a very generous offer from a man who is currently in debt to Vanguard Industrial, I observed mildly. I told him the holding company wasn't interested in a flat fee. Marcus continued, the gravel in his voice deepening. I told him the sole owner of Apex Innovation Partners handles all licensing negotiations personally, and that the owner requires a face-to-face meeting to discuss any transfer of intellectual property. "And what did Julian say to that?" I asked. "He asked for the owner's name and address. I gave him your address, Elias. He's on his way to your house right now. He thinks he's coming to buy a patent from a stranger who just happens to live in your neighborhood." I looked out the window. Down at the end of the street, a metallic gray Audi RS5 turned the corner, taking the curve way too fast, its tires squealing against the asphalt. "Thank you, Marcus. I will handle it from here," I said. I hung up the phone. The Audi slammed to a halt in my driveway. I stood up, left my oatmeal on the table, and walked toward the front door. The physics had run their course. It was time to show Julian the ledger. The front door did not just open. It practically vibrated on its hinges. Julian burst into the entryway, his chest heaving, his face flushed with a shade of red that had absolutely nothing to do with the Alabama heat. He was still wearing the same tailored suit from his celebratory dinner, but the jacket was unbuttoned, the silk tie was yanked sideways, and the expensive collar was completely soaked in sweat. He looked like a man who had just jumped out of an airplane and suddenly realized his parachute was packed entirely with dirty laundry. Clara came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her eyes wide with alarm. "Julian, honey, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" Julian ignored her. He didn't even look at his mother. His eyes were darting frantically around the living room, scanning the corners, looking up the staircase. He had a thick, crushed leather portfolio clutched in his right hand, his knuckles completely white from the pressure. He finally locked eyes with me. I was standing perfectly still, near the dining table, my hands resting lightly on the back of a wooden chair. I went very, very quiet. I let him fill the empty space. "Where is he?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. It wasn't the voice of a CEO anymore. It was the voice of a panicked kid who had just broken a window and knew the owner was walking up the driveway. "Marcus sent me here. He gave me this exact address. Who are you renting the guest room to, Elias?" "I need to speak to him right now." "I don't rent the guest room to anyone, Julian," I said, my voice dropping into that low, steady register. "You know that. We use it for storage." "Then why did Marcus send me here?" Julian shouted, pacing a tight circle on the hardwood floor. He ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining it completely. "My engineers tracked the patent holding company, Apex Innovation Partners. They own the rights to the internal stress relief channel for the Vanguard valves. I need that channel. Elias, the prototype detonated in the thermal oven this morning. Vanguard gave me 72 hours to fix the structural integrity, or they are going to trigger the breach of contract penalties. They are going to bankrupt me. So where is the guy who owns Apex?" Clara took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Julian, what are you talking about?" "Detonated. Bankrupt. You said the design was flawless. It was supposed to be." Julian snapped at his mother, a sudden ugly flash of temper that made Clara physically flinch. But the beryllium copper expanded too fast under 400 degrees. It locked the actuator pins. The whole system sheared apart. It's a microscopic error, a tiny fraction of an inch. But I can't legally machine the fix, because this Apex Ghost company filed a provisional patent on the exact solution 8 months ago. I pulled out the wooden chair and sat down at the dining table. The silence had weight to it again, but this time it was a suffocating, crushing weight. I reached inside my breast pocket, pulled out the folded, single-printed page that Marcus had given me and placed it flat on the table. Next to it, I placed my old black leather-bound ledger. "It wasn't an error, Julian," I said quietly. "And it wasn't a flaw. The copper expanded by exactly 0.004 inches. It expanded precisely as the laws of thermodynamics dictate it must expand. It was entirely predictable." Julian stopped pacing. He stared at me, his chest still heaving, a deep furrow forming between his brows. "How do you know the exact measurement of the expansion?" "Because I calculated it," I replied, resting my hands flat on the ledger. "I calculated it in February of 2024. I spent 3 weeks running the thermal stress simulations in my head before I ever committed a single line to the blueprint. I knew the steel housing would not be able to contain the beryllium expansion without a secondary channel to relieve the internal friction. You would have known that too, Julian, if you hadn't just taken photographs of my desk when I went to the bathroom. If you had actually bothered to read the mathematical footnotes in this ledger." I watched the realization hit him. It did not happen all at once. It happened in slow, agonizing layers, like a building collapsing floor by floor. His eyes darted from the black ledger to the printed paper, then back to my face. His jaw went slack. The portfolio in his hand slipped an inch. "No," Julian whispered, taking a slow step backward. "No, you don't. You're a machinist, Elias. You work in a garage. You don't know how to set up corporate LLCs in Delaware. You don't use blind patent lawyers." "I am a mechanical engineer," I corrected him, my voice perfectly level. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I designed systems that contain 25,000 pounds of pressure deep under the ocean floor. Did you honestly believe I couldn't navigate a simple federal corporate registry? I filed the core patent under Apex Innovation Partners through Marcus's firm before your mother and I even went on our anniversary trip. I saw you asking too many questions in the shop. Something in my stomach shifted. I measured twice. I cut once. "Julian," Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the reality of the conversation finally broke through her blind spot. Did you steal Elias's work? Did you take his designs? I borrowed them. Julian practically screamed, his panic mutating into cornered rage. He wasn't doing anything with them, Mom. He was just letting them sit in that stupid book. I have the Vanguard connections. I got the funding. He turned back to me, his eyes wild, pleading and demanding all at once. Listen to me, Elias. I will give you $50,000 right now. 100,000. I'll write you a check from the Vanguard advance. Just sign the licensing release for the stress channel, so my engineers can machine the fix. We keep this in the family. We all win. There is no Vanguard advance left, Julian, I said softly. You spent 110,000 on the CNC machine leases in Decatur. You spent 85,000 on your new Audi RS5. You've been paying your engineers out of pocket to expedite the prototypes. You don't have $100,000. Julian's face drained of color entirely. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the lever to pull. Vanguard will sue me, Elias. They will take everything. I signed a personal guarantee on the corporate charter. They will take my accounts, my car. They'll come after my apartment. That is what happens when a machine fails, I said. The operator takes the impact. Please, Julian begged, taking a step toward the table. His hands were actually shaking. You're my stepfather. You raised me. You wouldn't do this to me. You wouldn't just sit there and watch me burn. Family doesn't steal a man's life work while eating his food, I replied, the words landing like heavy stones in the quiet room. I told you, Julian. Cleverness is fast. What I do is slow. You assumed my silence was weakness. You assumed I was just a component in your machine. I will not be licensing the patent to you. Not for 100,000, not for 1,000,000. Then what do you want? Julian sobbed, the arrogance completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a terrified kid in an expensive suit. What do you want me to do? I opened the ledger. I took a pen from my pocket. I want your company, I said. I want you to sign 100% of the equity in your firm over to Apex Innovation Partners, effective immediately. You will resign as CEO. You will hand over the Vanguard contract to me. I will go to Decatur tomorrow. I will machine the stress relief channels myself, and I will deliver the 50 flawless prototypes to Vanguard on schedule under your company's name, which I will now own. I will save the contract, but you will not be a part of it. Julian stared at me, horrified. You want me to walk away with nothing after I set up the whole deal? If you don't, I said calmly, capping my pen, the 72-hour clock runs out. Vanguard sues you for breach of contract and fraud, completely wiping you out financially. And once the dust settles on that, Marcus will file a federal lawsuit against you for corporate espionage and intellectual property theft, which carries a mandatory prison sentence. Those are your parameters, Julian. You are completely out of leverage. Nobody said anything for a while. The only sound in the room was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I looked at Clara. She was crying silently, tears slipping down her cheeks, but she didn't step forward to defend him. She finally saw the structure of the boy she had raised, and she saw the massive cracks in his foundation. Julian looked at his mother, waiting for her to save him. When she simply turned her face away, he collapsed. He sank into one of the dining chairs, dropping his leather portfolio onto the floor. It hit the hardwood with a dull, heavy thud. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as the reality of his total catastrophic failure locked him in. The trap hadn't just snapped shut, it had buried him entirely. Julian signed the papers. It took him exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds to dismantle the entire illusion he had built over the last 6 months of his life. His hand was shaking so badly that the blue ink from my old Parker fountain pen smudged across the final line of the equity transfer agreement, leaving a dark, irregular stain on the clean white bond paper. He didn't look at me when he pushed the document back across the mahogany table. He didn't look at his mother either. He just stood up slowly, his movements stiff and awkward like an old machine whose gears were beginning to bind from a lack of oil. He picked up his empty leather portfolio from the floor, his fingers trailing over the polished brass clasp for a brief second, and then he walked out the front door. He didn't take the Audi. He left the heavy key fob sitting right on the dining table, resting exactly 2 inches away from my coffee cup, the metallic gray paint of the fob catching the pale afternoon light. He walked down Fountain Row on foot, his tailored navy jacket draped carelessly over his left shoulder like a discarded piece of cloth, moving slowly into the fading autumn light. I stood by the window and watched him until he disappeared around the far corner where the old oak trees lined the sidewalk. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel a sudden rush of adrenaline or satisfaction. I just felt the quiet, steady return of physical equilibrium. The atmospheric pressure in the room had finally normalized, and the air felt clean again. The next morning, at exactly 5:30 a.m., Marcus and I drove over to the manufacturing facility in Decatur. It was a sterile modern building with bright white corrugated metal walls and rows of automated CNC milling centers that looked like they belonged in a corporate aerospace promotional video rather than a working machine shop. Julian's engineers, a group of 4 bright, completely terrified kids who had graduated from Auburn University less than a year ago, were sitting in the small break room. They were staring blankly into paper cups of stale, lukewarm coffee, looking exactly like a ship's crew that had survived a catastrophic wreck, only to realize they were stranded on a barren island without a compass. When I walked through the door, wearing my old grease-stained canvas apron and carrying my black leather-bound engineering ledger under my arm, nobody said a word. The silence had that familiar weight to it. They know exactly who I was. In the manufacturing communities of northern Alabama, names circulate through the machine shops like folklore. They knew I was the man who had designed the custom high-pressure hydraulic manifold systems for the Tennessee Valley Authority back when their own fathers were still learning how to use a standard crescent wrench. I didn't give them a long speech. I didn't lecture them about their oversight or rub their faces in their failure. I walked straight over to the lead CNC terminal, opened my black ledger to page 142, and laid it flat on the metal console. I pointed a blunt, scarred finger at the primary housing schematics. "We are going to reprogram the secondary boring sequence immediately," I told them, keeping my voice flat, calm, and perfectly even. "We need to introduce a stress relief channel with a depth of exactly 0.004 inches along the inner diameter of the primary seal housing. We will use a carbide-tipped indexable boring tool, and we will slow the automated feed rate down to exactly 12 inches per minute to prevent material deflection. We will verify the dimensions of every 5th unit using a manual micrometer. No exceptions. If you rely entirely on the digital readout on that screen, you are letting the computer lie to you. Trust the metal, not the monitor." The youngest of the kids, a boy named Toby, who had a faint smudge of graphite across his forehead, looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. "Mr. Vance, we tried running the thermal expansion formulas last night after the failure. The math checks out perfectly with the channel. It absorbs the copper's growth completely. Why didn't Julian let us see this part of the schematic?" "Because Julian didn't know it existed, Toby," I said quietly. "He assumed that engineering was just a matter of copying lines on a page. He forgot that the lines represent physical realities, and physical realities do not care about your marketing schedule. Now let's get to work." They didn't argue. They didn't ask any more questions. They just moved. For the next 48 hours straight, I lived inside that manufacturing facility. I didn't sleep more than 3 hours a night, catching a few restless winks curled up on a hard canvas coat engine I found in the manager's supply closet. My 62-year-old bones ached with a dull, persistent throb. My eyes felt like someone had rubbed them with fine Huntsville sand, and my fingernails were stained black with fresh sulfurized cutting fluid. But the automated machines ran perfectly. The raw beryllium copper behaved exactly the way it was supposed to behave when given the proper clearance. When you treat the materials with the respect they demand, when you account for the immutable laws of physics instead of trying to outsmart them for a quick profit, the universe cooperates with you. We delivered the 50 completed prototype units to the Vanguard Industrial Testing Headquarters at exactly 7:45 a.m. on Tuesday morning, 15 minutes before the 72-hour contractual deadline expired. The lead safety inspector, a severe, unsmiling man named Henderson, who had spent 34 years rejecting substandard components for major aerospace and defense firms, loaded the first 10 valves into the heavy thermal simulation oven. He didn't say a word to me. He just cranked the ambient temperature up to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, he dialed the internal hydraulic pressure up to 26,000 psi, 1,000 pounds beyond the maximum specifications listed in the original contract. I stood behind the reinforced safety glass, my hands folded loosely behind my back, my right thumb tapping the crystal face of my watch in that slow, familiar rhythm. I counted the seconds in my head. The valves did not fail. The internal actuator pins moved with a smooth, fluid, almost silent precision. The primary seals held perfectly, and the red pressure needle on the master gauge remained completely frozen, locked in place like a steel monument to accurate measurement. Henderson watched the digital monitors for 20 uninterrupted minutes before finally turning around to face me. He didn't smile. Men like Henderson don't smile at work, but he extended a rough, calloused hand toward me. "Exceptional engineering, Mr. Vance," Henderson said, his voice echoing in the concrete testing bay. "The structural integrity is flawless. The contract stands. The bulk production funding will be released to Apex Innovation Partners by Friday afternoon." I thanked him, shook his hand firmly, and walked out into the bright Alabama sunshine. I drove back to Huntsville in complete silence, the truck's air conditioner blowing cold against my face, listening to the familiar, healthy purr of my engine. The bulk money arrived in the holding account exactly 3 days later. $3,500,000. It was more money than I had made in the last 10 years of running my custom design shop combined. I called Marcus that same afternoon and told him to distribute 40% of the initial release directly into the personal accounts of those 4 young engineers who had worked the line with me in Decatur. They had earned every single penny of it through sweat and discipline, and unlike my stepson, they actually respected the integrity of the craft. I kept the remaining funds in the Apex corporate account to establish a permanent, specialized apprenticeship program for local high school kids who wanted to learn mechanical engineering, the old-fashioned way, with their hands on the raw metal instead of their fingers on a plastic keyboard. Clara was waiting for me when I finally walked through the front door that evening. The house was peaceful, the kitchen smelling faintly of ground cinnamon and roasted chicken. We didn't talk about Julian that night, and in truth, we haven't talked about him much at all in the 2 years that have passed since that Saturday morning. He packed his bags and moved to Atlanta a few weeks after the contract was fully settled. I hear from Marcus occasionally that Julian is currently working as a junior assistant manager at a commercial real estate firm near Buckhead. He doesn't drive a gray Audi anymore. He drives the sensible pre-owned sedan that he pays for entirely with his own monthly salary. He sends his mother a brief, polite card on her birthday. And he calls her for 10 minutes every Christmas Day. Our personal relationship is completely non-existent, but he is civil to his mother now, and he no longer looks at the world as something he can simply plunder without consequence. That's enough for me. Some days I wonder if I did the right thing by letting the trap snap shut so coldly. Most days I know I did. That's enough. I don't regret what I did to protect my legacy. I only regret that I had to do it to a boy I raised. Kindness is a word that sounds like softness to the ignorant, but true kindness requires a hard border. Sometimes, the only way to save a young man from his own arrogance is to let the system he built crush his illusions before it has a chance to crush his life. Yesterday evening, after the sun had slipped behind the old pine trees near Fountain City, I walked out to my workshop. The air was cool, carrying the faint, sharp scent of cedar and damp earth. I stood by the right side of my desk, exactly 3 inches from the edge, and picked up the Starrett 120 caliper. It felt heavy, cold, and completely unchanging in my hand. I wiped a stray speck of dust off the silver dial face with the corner of my canvas shirt, then placed it down precisely where it belonged, on the green cutting mat. I put on my work apron, out of old habit. I turned on the lathe, not to make anything in particular, just to hear it. The steady low hum filled the empty room, a perfect, predictable mechanical frequency that told me the ledger was balanced, the measurements were accurate, and everything was exactly where it belonged.